Nobody locked the doors in that house. Yet I felt trapped every single day. When people hear the word toxic, they imagine shouting, insults, or dramatic fights. That was not what happened in the Brooks house. The danger was quieter than that. It lived inside routines. It hid inside smiles. It appeared in conversations that sounded harmless until you realized every decision had already been made for you. My name is Claire Brooks. I was 33 years old when I moved into the house that would slowly convince me I no longer trusted my own judgment. At first, everything seemed reasonable. Daniel and I had been married for less than a year. Housing prices were high. His mother, Eleanor, had a large home outside Cincinnati with plenty of room. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. 6 months, maybe a year. Save money. Build our future. Then move out. That was the plan. At least, that was the plan I thought we shared. The first rule appeared 3 days after I moved in. Breakfast had to be served at exactly 7 o'clock every morning. Not because anyone had work obligations. Not because there was an emergency. That was simply how Eleanor preferred things. When I suggested sleeping in on a Saturday, she smiled politely and said structure was important for a successful household. Daniel nodded in agreement. I told myself it was not a big deal. Then came the second rule. Guests required approval. Not official approval, of course. Nothing was ever stated directly. But whenever I invited a friend over, Eleanor somehow managed to create complications. The timing was inconvenient. The house needed cleaning. She was not feeling well. Eventually, I stopped inviting people altogether. Again, Daniel insisted she was only trying to keep things organized. The third rule involved money. Every major purchase became a family discussion. A couch. A television. Even vacation plans. Somehow Eleanor's opinion carried more weight than anyone else's. Whenever I disagreed, Daniel would pull me aside afterward and ask why I could not be more understanding. According to him, his mother had years of experience. She only wanted what was best for us. I remember standing in our bedroom one evening staring at a paint sample for a home office I hoped to create. I had spent weeks planning the space. Before I could order supplies, Eleanor informed me that the room would be better used for storage. Daniel agreed within seconds. The conversation ended before it truly began. Little moments like that accumulated over time. Each one seemed insignificant on its own. Together they formed something much larger. Something heavier. Something I struggled to describe. The hardest part was that Eleanor never appeared cruel. To neighbors, she was generous. To relatives, she was thoughtful. To strangers, she was charming. Sometimes I wondered if the problem was me. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I expected too much independence. Those doubts followed me everywhere. One evening, while clearing dishes after dinner, I overheard Eleanor making plans for Daniel's future. Career decisions. Financial goals. Even where we might eventually live. She spoke as though the choices already belonged to her. Daniel listened without objection. When I finally asked whether my opinion mattered, both of them looked genuinely surprised. That was the moment I realized I was living in a house where every choice required permission. The longer I lived in that house, the harder it became to ignore a pattern that seemed obvious to everyone except Daniel. Whenever there was a disagreement, the outcome was already decided before the conversation even began. It did not matter whether the issue involved finances, schedules, holidays, or future plans. Somehow Eleanor's opinion always carried the final vote. At first, I tried to be patient. I reminded myself that Daniel had spent his entire life listening to his mother. Habits formed over decades do not disappear overnight. Still, each new situation chipped away at something inside me. One Sunday afternoon, I suggested taking a weekend trip to Nashville. We had both been working hard, and I thought a short getaway would be good for us. Daniel smiled and said it sounded nice. For a few hours, I actually felt hopeful. Then Eleanor overheard the discussion during dinner. She mentioned that traveling was unnecessary when there were projects around the house that needed attention. Within minutes, Daniel agreed that postponing the trip was probably the responsible choice. The vacation disappeared before we had even booked a hotel. A month later, I was offered an opportunity to take on a larger role at work. The position came with more responsibility and a significant increase in salary. I was excited, proud even. When I shared the news, Eleanor immediately questioned whether the workload would interfere with family obligations. Daniel asked many of the same questions. By the end of the evening, a conversation that should have celebrated my achievement had somehow become a discussion about potential problems. I accepted the promotion anyway, but the joy I felt initially had been reduced to something much smaller. The most painful moments were often the quietest. I would be speaking during dinner and notice Daniel looking toward his mother before responding. I would share an idea and watch him evaluate her reaction before offering his own opinion. Sometimes I wondered if he even realized he was doing it. Other times, I suspected he did. One evening, I sat alone on the back porch after everyone had gone inside. The summer air felt warm and still. Through the kitchen window, I could see Daniel and Eleanor talking. They seemed comfortable together. Familiar. Aligned. Looking at them, I suddenly felt like a guest in my own marriage. That realization frightened me more than any argument ever could. A few days later, I called my friend Nancy Walker. We had known each other since college, and she was one of the few people who always spoke honestly. After listening quietly for nearly an hour, she asked a question nobody else had asked. "Claire, when was the last time Daniel chose you when it mattered?" I opened my mouth to answer immediately. Then I stopped. The silence that followed felt endless. I thought about the vacation, the promotion, the house decisions, the daily routines. One memory after another surfaced. Yet I could not find a single example. Not one. When the call ended, I sat staring at my phone long after the screen went dark. For the first time, I stopped asking whether Eleanor was controlling. I stopped wondering whether I was being too sensitive. Instead, I began asking a much harder question. What happens when the person you married never truly leaves his mother's side? After my conversation with Nancy, I began paying closer attention to the people around me. Not just Daniel. Everyone. Once I stopped assuming Eleanor's behavior was normal, I noticed something unsettling. The entire family seemed to orbit around her. At birthday parties, relatives waited for her approval before making plans. During holiday gatherings, conversations shifted the moment she entered the room. Even small decisions somehow found their way back to her. It was as if an invisible set of rules governed every interaction. The strangest part was that nobody appeared to question it. One Saturday afternoon, Eleanor hosted a family lunch at the house. Several cousins, aunts, and longtime family friends attended. I spent most of the morning helping prepare food and organize the dining room. By the time everyone arrived, the house felt crowded and noisy. At first, the gathering seemed pleasant enough. People laughed. Children played in the backyard. Plates of food circulated around the table. Then the conversations began. A cousin mentioned buying a new home. Before anyone could congratulate him, he turned toward Eleanor and asked whether she thought the purchase was wise. Later, another relative discussed changing jobs. Again, the first opinion requested belonged to Eleanor. I watched the pattern repeat throughout the afternoon. Nobody appeared afraid of her. In fact, many genuinely admired her. Yet admiration had somehow evolved into dependence. Every major decision seemed to require her blessing. As the hours passed, I became increasingly aware of my own position in the room. I was present, but not truly included. People treated me politely. They smiled. They asked questions. Yet beneath the surface, I sensed a barrier I could not fully explain. Several times, conversations abruptly changed when I approached. At one point, I entered the kitchen and found two relatives discussing family finances. The moment they noticed me, the topic disappeared. A few minutes later, I overheard someone describe me as independent. The word itself sounded harmless. The tone suggested otherwise. That evening, after the guests left, I mentioned my observations to Daniel. His reaction was immediate. He insisted I was imagining problems that did not exist. According to him, his mother was simply respected because of her experience and wisdom. I asked whether respect should require everyone to surrender their own opinions. He laughed softly and told me I was overthinking things again. The conversation ended exactly the way so many conversations had ended before. My concerns dismissed. My perspective minimized. Later that night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the upstairs hallway. Most of the house was dark. As I passed the study that had once belonged to Robert Brooks, I noticed the door standing slightly open. The room had remained mostly untouched since his death several years earlier. Eleanor rarely entered it. Daniel never mentioned it. Something about the quiet room drew my attention. I stepped inside and looked around. Shelves lined the walls. Old books sat exactly where they had been left. Framed photographs covered the desk. The air carried the faint scent of aged paper and wood. Then I noticed a worn leather notebook tucked behind several books on the highest shelf. It looked old, forgotten, hidden. I stood there staring at it for several seconds before reaching up to pull it free. The name embossed on the cover stopped me cold. Robert Brooks. For several moments, I simply stood there holding the notebook in both hands. The house was silent around me. Everyone else had already gone to bed. Moonlight filtered through the study window and stretched across Robert's old desk. I do not know exactly what I expected to find inside the journal. Perhaps a collection of personal memories. Perhaps notes about work or retirement. What I found instead made me sit down immediately. The first pages seemed ordinary enough. Robert wrote about family dinners, vacations, home repairs, and everyday events. His handwriting was neat and deliberate. The entries felt honest, familiar. Then the tone slowly began to change. As the years passed, his observations became more reflective, more cautious. He often wrote about family decisions and the challenges of maintaining peace inside the household. One entry caught my attention immediately. Robert described how difficult it had become to express disagreement without creating tension. He never mentioned arguments. He never described dramatic confrontations. Instead, he wrote about subtle pressure, expectations, the feeling that certain opinions carried more weight than others. I continued reading. Several pages later, Robert described situations where he had changed his mind simply to avoid conflict. At first, I assumed he was referring to ordinary marriage compromises. Then I noticed a sentence underlined twice. Peace is not the same thing as agreement. I stared at those words for a long time. They felt painfully familiar. Another entry described a family gathering where everyone followed a plan that nobody actually wanted. According to Robert, people had become so accustomed to one person's preferences that they stopped offering alternatives altogether. Reading his observations felt strangely unsettling. The details differed from my own experiences, but the patterns felt almost identical. For years, I had questioned whether I was imagining things. Now I was reading the thoughts of someone who seemed to have noticed the same dynamics long before I entered the family. The deeper I went into the journal, the more complicated my emotions became. Part of me felt validated. Another part felt sad. Robert clearly loved his family. His writing never sounded bitter. If anything, he seemed determined to preserve harmony. Yet underneath that effort, I sensed exhaustion. Toward the back of the notebook, I discovered a folded piece of paper tucked between 2 pages. It was not a journal entry. It was a handwritten list. Names, dates, financial decisions, property discussions, notes about meetings that had taken place years earlier. Several items were marked with question marks. Others included reminders to verify information later. I did not fully understand what I was looking at, but one thing became clear. Robert had been tracking details for a reason. The next morning, I carried the notebook downstairs and spent hours rereading sections while the house remained quiet. Every page raised new questions. Every observation seemed connected to something larger. When Daniel finally came into the kitchen, I considered showing him the journal. The thought disappeared almost immediately. Experience had taught me exactly how that conversation would end. Instead, I quietly closed the notebook and placed it beside me. For the first time since moving into the house, I felt something unexpected. Not fear. Not frustration. Curiosity. Because if Robert had been documenting concerns for years, then there was a good chance the answers I needed were still somewhere inside that house waiting to be found. 2 days after finding Robert's journal, I met Nancy for coffee at a small cafe near downtown Cincinnati. I brought the notebook with me, carefully wrapped inside a canvas tote bag. Throughout the drive, I debated whether sharing it was the right decision. Part of me worried I was invading a private piece of Robert's life. Another part believed he had left those observations behind for a reason. When Nancy arrived, she immediately noticed the tension on my face. After ordering our drinks, I placed the journal on the table and explained everything I had discovered. She listened without interrupting. Every now and then, she nodded as though certain details confirmed suspicions she had carried for years. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment before speaking. What she told me changed the way I viewed the entire family. Nancy explained that long before I married Daniel, several people in the community had noticed unusual patterns inside the Brooks household. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would attract public attention. Instead, there was a constant expectation that Eleanor's preferences would become everyone's decisions. According to Nancy, Robert had once been far more independent than the version I knew through family stories. He had his own opinions, his own friendships, and his own plans. Over time, however, many of those things gradually disappeared. Nancy stressed that Eleanor was not cruel in the traditional sense. She was persuasive, organized, exceptionally skilled at making people believe her ideas were their own. The description felt painfully familiar. Then Nancy shared something even more surprising. Several years before Robert passed away, he had confided in a mutual friend. He reportedly worried that Daniel had become too dependent on his mother's approval. At the time, most people dismissed the concern as an aging father being overly cautious. Looking back, the warning seemed impossible to ignore. As Nancy spoke, pieces of my own experience began connecting in ways they never had before. The canceled vacation, the promotion conversation, the endless household rules. None of those incidents existed in isolation. They belonged to a larger pattern stretching back years. For the first time, I stopped seeing myself as the cause of the tension. I had spent so much energy trying to become easier to live with, more understanding, more flexible, more patient. Yet no amount of adjustment ever changed the outcome, because the problem was never really about me. Before we left the cafe, Nancy asked a simple question. If Robert was documenting concerns and tracking important decisions, what else might he have left behind? The question stayed with me all afternoon. That evening, I returned home and reread the folded list hidden inside the journal. Names, dates, financial discussions, property references. Several entries pointed toward boxes stored in the attic. I had seen those boxes before but never paid much attention to them. Now they seemed important. After everyone went to bed, I stood at the bottom of the attic stairs staring into the darkness above. Something told me Robert's journal was only the beginning. If answers existed, they were waiting somewhere in those forgotten boxes. The attic smelled of dust, cardboard, and forgotten years. I waited until nearly midnight before climbing the narrow staircase. The house was silent. Daniel had fallen asleep downstairs in front of the television, and Eleanor had retired to her room hours earlier. For the first time since moving into the house, I felt less like a guest and more like an investigator searching for answers. The boxes sat exactly where I remembered them, stacked neatly beneath the sloped ceiling. Most were labeled in Robert's handwriting. Holiday decorations, tax records, home repairs, family photographs. Nothing appeared unusual at first glance. Then I noticed a smaller box pushed toward the back corner. Unlike the others, it had no label. A thin layer of dust covered the lid. It looked as though nobody had touched it in years. I carefully pulled it forward and opened it. Inside were folders filled with documents, property records, financial statements, meeting notes, correspondence. The deeper I searched, the more confused I became. Several documents referenced decisions that Eleanor had described very differently over the years. One folder contained paperwork related to a parcel of land Robert once considered purchasing. According to family stories, he had abandoned the idea because it was too risky. Yet the documents suggested something else. The property had received positive evaluations and strong recommendations from advisors. Another folder described investment opportunities that had been rejected despite favorable projections. In each case, Robert appeared interested. In each case, the final decision moved in a different direction. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor reviewing page after page. A pattern slowly emerged. The issue was not money itself. The issue was influence. Certain choices seemed to become impossible once Eleanor opposed them. The realization sent a chill through me. Suddenly, Robert's journal made even more sense. He had not been documenting random frustrations. He had been recording a long history of decisions shaped by pressure rather than agreement. Near the bottom of the box, I found a sealed envelope addressed to Andrew Sutton. The name sounded familiar. After a few moments, I remembered where I had heard it before. Andrew had once served as a financial advisor to Robert. His name appeared several times throughout the journal and on multiple documents inside the attic box. Curiosity overcame hesitation. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a draft letter written by Robert, but apparently never mailed. The contents were brief. Robert thanked Andrew for his honesty and expressed concern about preserving accurate records for future reference. He also mentioned that family disagreements sometimes made objective conversations difficult. The wording remained respectful, but the meaning felt unmistakable. Robert had been worried. Deeply worried. By the time I returned everything to the box, nearly 2 hours had passed. I carried the envelope and several copies of documents back to my room. Sleep never came. Instead, I sat beside the window watching darkness slowly give way to dawn. The evidence was no longer limited to feelings, observations, or memories. Actual records existed. Actual questions remained unanswered. As sunlight filled the room, I made a decision. If Andrew Sutton was still alive and willing to speak, he might provide the missing pieces Robert never had the chance to explain. For the first time, I felt closer to the truth than ever before. And something told me that truth was about to test my marriage in ways I had never imagined. The following week became the turning point I had been dreading for months. After several phone calls, I finally reached Andrew Sutton. He was retired now and living outside Lexington, Kentucky. At first, he seemed hesitant to discuss anything connected to the Brooks family. Then I mentioned Robert's journal. The silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds. When Andrew finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of surprise and sadness. He agreed to meet me. 2 days later, I drove nearly 90 miles to a small office he still maintained for occasional consulting work. Andrew greeted me warmly and immediately recognized Robert's handwriting when I showed him several pages from the journal. For more than an hour, we talked. He never accused anyone of wrongdoing. He never spoke with bitterness. Instead, he described a man who often struggled to separate his own wishes from the expectations placed upon him. According to Andrew, Robert frequently arrived at meetings enthusiastic about opportunities and future plans. Yet many of those plans quietly disappeared after family discussions at home. The pattern sounded painfully familiar. As our conversation continued, Andrew shared something that affected me deeply. Years before his death, Robert expressed concern that Daniel was becoming overly dependent on seeking approval before making important decisions. Andrew remembered the comment because it came up repeatedly. Robert worried that his son was learning to avoid conflict rather than develop confidence in his own judgment. When the meeting ended, Andrew handed me copies of several old correspondence records that Robert had legally retained. None of them contained shocking revelations. What they provided was something more important. Confirmation. The concerns documented in the journal were real. They had existed long before I entered the family. During the drive home, I felt strangely calm. The evidence no longer pointed toward a misunderstanding. It pointed toward a generational pattern. That evening, I asked Daniel if we could talk privately. We sat together in the den after Eleanor had gone upstairs. I showed him the journal entries. I showed him the attic documents. I explained what Andrew had told me. At first, Daniel listened quietly. Then the familiar defenses appeared. He insisted his mother always wanted the best for everyone. He argued that Robert's concerns were being interpreted incorrectly. He questioned why I was spending so much time revisiting the past. For nearly an hour, we talked in circles. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing inside me for months. If evidence, history, and the experiences of multiple people all pointed in the same direction, what would it take for him to consider another possibility? Daniel looked away. His answer arrived so softly I almost missed it. He said he could not imagine his mother being wrong about something so important. In that moment, everything became clear. The conversation was never really about documents or journals. It was about loyalty. I sat there staring at the man I loved and realized he had reached a crossroads. So had I. Then footsteps echoed from the hallway. Eleanor appeared in the doorway and immediately sensed the tension in the room. What happened next would force Daniel to make the choice he had spent his entire life avoiding. For a few seconds after Eleanor entered the room, nobody spoke. She looked from Daniel to me, then to the documents spread across the coffee table. Her expression remained calm, but I could see her evaluating the situation. She had spent years reading people, years controlling conversations before they fully developed. This time felt different. The evidence was no longer hidden in journals or attic boxes. It sat openly in front of all three of us. Eleanor slowly took a seat and asked what was going on. Daniel immediately began explaining. Not the documents. Not Robert's concerns. Not Andrew's observations. Instead, he focused on my investigation. He described the journal, the attic records, the meetings. Listening to him speak felt surreal. Even now, his instinct was not to examine the information. His instinct was to defend his mother from it. Eleanor listened quietly. When he finished, she turned toward me and asked a simple question. Did I truly believe she had spent years trying to control the family? I paused before answering. Then I told her the truth. I believed many decisions inside the family had revolved around her preferences for a very long time. I believed Robert noticed it. I believed Andrew noticed it. I believed I had experienced it personally. The room became very still. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She did not become angry. Instead, she began explaining her perspective. She spoke about sacrifice, responsibility, the challenges of holding a family together through difficult times. Much of what she said was reasonable. Some of it was even admirable. Yet something important remained missing. Accountability. Every story ended with someone else's choice. Someone else's misunderstanding. Someone else's interpretation. Never her own role. As the conversation continued, I realized the issue was no longer whether Eleanor had influenced the family. The issue was whether Daniel could acknowledge that influence at all. Eventually, I looked directly at him. I asked whether he believed his father's concerns deserved consideration. I asked whether years of documented observations mattered. Most importantly, I asked whether my experiences as his wife mattered. The answer did not arrive immediately. Daniel stared at the floor for several moments. Then he looked toward his mother. I watched the familiar pattern unfold one final time. The hesitation, the uncertainty, the search for approval. When he finally spoke, his words landed with more force than any A. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For a few moments, I lay quietly staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house. The creak of old floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the distant chirping of birds outside the window. Everything sounded exactly the same as it had the day before. Yet, something inside me had changed completely. The uncertainty was gone. The endless questioning was gone. I no longer needed to wonder whether I belonged there. I already knew the answer. Slowly, I got out of bed and began packing. Not dramatically. Not angrily. One suitcase. Then another. Clothes. Personal documents. Family photographs. A few books. The process felt strangely peaceful. Every item I placed inside those bags felt like a step toward reclaiming something I had almost forgotten. Myself. Around 8 o'clock, Daniel found me carrying a box toward my car. The look on his face told me he finally understood what was happening. He asked where I was going. I told him the truth. I was leaving. At first, he seemed shocked, then confused. He reminded me that every marriage faced challenges. He said we could work through this together. Listening to him hurt more than I expected because part of me knew he believed those words. The problem was that he still did not understand why we had reached this moment. I asked him one final question. If the same situation happened again tomorrow, would he make a different choice? The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. It was enough. He never answered directly. He did not have to. We both knew. Before leaving, I walked through the house one last time. The kitchen where so many conversations ended with someone else's opinion becoming the final decision. The dining room where I learned to stay quiet. The hallway lined with family photographs that told only part of the story. None of it made me angry anymore. For the first time, I saw the house clearly. It was not evil. It was not cursed. It was simply a place built around a dynamic that left no room for equal voices. Outside, Eleanor stood on the front porch watching me load the final box into my car. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then she wished me well. The words sounded sincere. I believe she meant them. That was the strange part about everything I had learned. Eleanor never viewed herself as the problem. She genuinely believed she was protecting her family. Unfortunately, protection without boundaries can become control without intention. I wished her well too. Then I got into my car and drove away. Several months later, my life looked very different. I rented a small apartment. I focused on my career. I spent more time with friends. Slowly, I began trusting my own voice again. The most surprising change was how light everything felt. Not because my problems disappeared. Because I stopped carrying responsibilities that never belonged to me. Sometimes people ask whether I regret leaving. The answer is simple. No. I loved Daniel. Part of me always will. But love alone cannot replace mutual respect. It cannot survive when one person's voice matters less than another's. In the end, Daniel chose the relationship he understood best. And for the first time in a very long time, I chose myself. That decision gave me something the Brooks house never could. Freedom.